Let's wrap this chapter up with some suggestions for managing scope. And this is kind of a list of items that any project manager should know about. And a lot of this starts with clear user requirements. If you develop a process for managing requirements and then stick to that process, you'll be better positioned to manage scope throughout the life of the project. And that's something we've discussed a couple times in these videos. Prototyping involves developing a working replica for testing and feedback. And if you develop prototypes of the end result, you can use those to make sure that you're not adding too many things and deviating too much from the work breakdown structure and the work that you're required to do to meet the scope targets. Use case modeling involves deciding how the end result is going to work in the real world. And if it's not going to work in the real world, then don't do it and go back to your original scope. There's also joint application design, which is a way of involving all stakeholders in the scope process. It's also important to put requirements in writing and have them available for anyone who asks so that you can always refer back to the requirements and know whether or not you're sticking to those. It's a good idea to create a requirements management database if you have a big project so that you can look at and not just read a list of requirements, but have a way of searching requirements and making sure that they are either met or not met as you go throughout the project. Test early, test often is going to help you stick with your scope targets and scope goals. It's also important to have a process in place for reviewing requirements as they change. And if we refer back to Chapter 3, the process groups, you should have some sort of processes in place to deal with controlling scope, reviewing change, and things like that, so that on your projects, this is the process that we use to make sure we are adding requirements or changing requirements in an appropriate manner. A lot of this goes back to the importance of good planning. It's difficult to overstate how important the early planning stages are in terms of managing things like scope. Proactive management causes a lot of prevents, I was going to say it causes a lot of projects to be completed successfully, which I guess you could say it does. It prevents a lot of problems. And a proactive manager will emphasize completion dates and set deadlines and stick to them. And of course, there's some variance that you can allow for, but the more you can plan things out in advance and then stick with those plans, the better it's going to be for everyone. Allocate resources for handling change requests. Don't be caught off guard. Have a process in place for dealing with changes. So when they happen, you know that this is the process that we use to deal with changes. They need to go through these steps and be approved by these people. Off-the-shelf software can help you manage the scope and create a work breakdown structure. You don't need any special software to create a work breakdown structure. You can, but you don't have to. Microsoft Project will do just fine for most people. Finally, if we look at agile environments, agile values processes over scope. And in agile, if you remember, it's not about setting specific scope goals, but really a product backlog. So at the beginning of a sprint, you know that you've got these different items to work on. So you work on those and you create some versions of the product and you have a shippable version at the end or shippable prototype. Then you go back to that backlog and maybe you've added more items to that backlog. But it changes much more over time than a traditional project. And scope is kind of defined throughout the life of the project. It's revisited and revised continually, and you have several usable versions released. It's not quite the same as dealing with scope on a traditional waterfall style project. The point here is that scope management in Agile isn't about sticking to one predetermined scope and never deviating from it. Instead, it's about adapting, changing, and putting out versions of a project or the end result of a project. Agile starts with that backlog, and then the scope for each sprint is decided. When the sprint is completed, you're done with that version, go back to the backlog, and following those processes will lead to successful Agile projects and successful scope management in Agile projects. The bottom line here, if you create a work breakdown structure and stick to it, it's going to help you manage scope, and the more detailed you can get on that work breakdown structure, the better your plans are going to be. It's important to use that along with a lot of other processes, especially user involvement, to control the scope and make sure you have a way of managing scope changes. So I hope you have a good sense of what it means to deal with scope management on a project after all of this. So let's go back to that opening case for a second. What about Kim and that upgrade? Well, she met with her team, decided how to proceed. She crafted a work breakdown structure using existing templates, which is always a good way to do it, and everything got off to a good start. So good job, Kim. That'll do it for Chapter 5, Scope Management.